Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, January 27th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the Senate Democratic Party focusing on making sure the District of Columbia is the 51st state in the United States today. Senator Tom Carper from the state of Delaware has announced that he is reintroducing legislation to make D.C. the next United States state. And D.C. statehood has been something that's been in discussion, especially amongst the Democratic Party, for a very significant period of time. But the Senate Democrats could never bring up enough energy from the Democrats nationwide and in the Senate to actually get this done. Even when Democrats had majorities that were 59-41 or even 60-40, statehood was off the table because people did not want it. But now, the majority of Americans pretty much agree that D.C. should become the next state. On top of that, Democrats are now in control, and it looks as if most Democrats, if not all, are open to considering statehood. Now, Democrats need to ensure that they get all 50 votes, including 10 Republican votes. But if the Democrats are able to get rid of the filibuster, which undoubtedly Mitch McConnell will filibuster D.C. becoming a state, then they only need 51 votes to introduce D.C. as the 51st state. And this, this is something that you see in D.C. when you're talking about taxation without representation. It's very ironic that our nation's capital, home to nearly 1 million citizens, doesn't even have congressional representation with a voting body. They have these things called shadow senators and shadow representatives that are pretty much just there, that are technical representatives but do not have any voting power whatsoever. So looking at D.C. statehood, this would actually allow D.C. to have a representative and 2 senators. So looking at D.C., it's bigger than 2 other states in the union, which doesn't really, help the argument that D.C. is too small to be a state. Land-wise, it would be the smallest state in the union, but then again, we do have very small states with very small populations as well. So D.C. isn't exactly too abnormal by being a small state if it was to be passed. But this is something that Democrats absolutely could do within the first 2 years of Joe Biden's presidency. Making D.C. a state would help them for elections to come in the United States Senate, the United States House of Representatives, and D.C. has always pretty much had, at least not always, but has had 3 electoral votes on the electoral map for a few decades now. And when you're looking at the District of Columbia voting history, they have never voted for a Republican. Never in D.C. history have they ever voted for anyone but a Democrat. And that's exactly why some Republicans are now opposed to D.C. becoming a state. Because if D.C. does become a state, it will introduce 2 new Democratic senators and a Democratic House of Representatives member that will never leave. There will never be a Republican winning here for as long as, I can see into the future. Looking at D.C.'s voting history, and, even when Ronald Reagan was on that ballot, and even when George H.W. Bush won with over 400 electoral votes, it wasn't enough to make D.C. even remotely competitive. I mean, even remotely competitive. And you will see in just a moment when I show you the historical voting pattern in the state, in the District of Columbia. So this is something Tom Carper is now reintroduced, and the House of Representatives is likely to pass D.C. statehood. They did just a year ago, so I have no doubt in my mind that they would do it again. But then it would have to go to the United States Senate, and if the Senate approves of it, well, D.C. would join the Union as a state. This would, that's the only thing that needs to be done. There are some constitutional scholars that are discussing whether or not that's true, based off of, I guess, based off an amendment, but based off of everything that we've seen, the precedent sort of is that if D.C. wants to become a state, all it has to do is go through the House and go through the Senate, and then it becomes a state. Then it becomes the 51st state in the United States. So that's really just a lot of people grasping for straws. Realistically, D.C. can become a state through a Democratic-controlled Senate. But so far, since this is a major piece of legislation, you can expect Mitch McConnell to do everything he can to stop this. He knows that if the Democrats are able to make D.C. a state, they will not be able to win back the majority in 2022 super easily. Right now, all they need is 1 seat. If they get rid of, if they add Maryland, D.C. We'll talk about why I chose Maryland in just a moment. But if they have to oppose 2 Democratic senators in D.C., well, that's going to make it very difficult for Senate Republicans to win back the majority, given that they will now have to go over 51 rather than just 50. All it takes right now is 1 seat. It'll take 2 seats if D.C. is introduced. And if Democrats gain seats, it makes it even a larger deficit for the Republicans to actually overcome in future elections. So D.C. statehood would be very consequential to Republicans in terms of political maneuvering, but also I don't think just because a state is super partisan, or a would-be state is super partisan, that should be a disqualifying factor for it becoming a state. Because the same argument can be made, looking at Wyoming, looking at North Dakota, looking at South Dakota, or even Democratic states, looking at states such as California and Maryland, states that are very lopsided in one direction, are they now disqualified as states because of their partisanship? It's not that DC, I don't think we should ever be discussing the political implications as a negative reason for a singular area from joining the United States. There are plenty of areas controlled by the United States that would all like to become states. Many of them would like to become states, but people discuss the implications of them becoming states. If the political implication is the only reason you can imagine as to why DC should not become a state, then that's invalid. That is not a good argument. It doesn't matter, because the Republican Party would not have a problem with it if DC was safe for the GOP, the same way Democrats do not have a problem with it now. But political partisanship should never be a reason to disqualify nearly 1 million residents from having congressional representation. Never. And the same argument can be made for Puerto Rico. As someone who runs a political YouTube channel, I think it's super important that every voice is heard in America, even those on, the Mariana Islands, in Puerto Rico, in Guam. I think they all should have a voice in what happens in our country because they are United States citizens. They can enlist in the army, they can pay taxes, but they can't vote. They can't vote simply on the fact that they're not a state. But that doesn't really make sense. They're enjoying all of the other liberties and also doing a lot of the things that America requires them to do, but they simply can't vote. And D.C. is the most ironic place for this to actually happen because this is where Congress meets. And I understand the importance of having a federal district, but D.C. statehood, this bill actually has given us a map where they can cut out the federal district, they can cut out the White House, they can cut out the Washington Monument, the Congressional Building. That will be the federal district, but all the surrounding areas will now be a new state. And I think that's something that Democrats would like to happen, but I don't think political partisanship should ever be a reason as to why a new area should not be introduced as a state. If these people have been, DC's been around since the beginning of the United States. So really, this has been centuries in the making for the District of Columbia. But also, since we are talking about partisanship, I just want to show you why Democrats are actually very happy that DC is front and center for potential statehood. They voted for Joe Biden by 87 percentage points. In 2016, Clinton won it by 86. Obama won it by 84 in 2012, and Obama won it by 86 in 2008. Even Kerry won it by 80 percentage points in 2004. Gore won it by 76. In 1992, Clinton won it by 76. In 1996, and in 1992, the same number. 1988, look at this map, 426 electoral votes for George Bush. Dukakis still won it by 68 percentage points. It's not that he got 68%, he won by 68%. Huge margin. The next year before that, or the 4 years before that, even in 1984, when Ronald Reagan won with 525 electoral votes, winning every single state in the union except for one, D.C. still voted for Walter Mondale by 72%. Not even remotely close. That would be the largest margin of victory applied to our map. If this was a state, it would be the state with the most lopsided margin of victory for a certain candidate. And that's Walter Mondale's performance against one of the best performing Republicans in United States history. Going to 1980, Carter won it by 62. And in 1972, Carter won it by 65 percentage points. So looking at the results in a number of these states, while the entire country may have shifted from being Republican in 1984, a lot of states voting for Democrats in 1992, and then about evening out now, DC has always remained one way, which is why Democrats are 100% confident that if DC becomes a state, they will now have 2 new Democratic senators. And where does that put us? 52 Democrats to 50 Republicans. So DC, no doubt in my mind that it will vote overwhelmingly for Democrats election after election. I can't imagine in my entire lifetime that DC does not become a state. That DC does not vote for a Democrat. Joe Biden won DC with 92% of the vote to Donald Trump's 5%. Donald Trump got 5% of the vote in the District of Columbia. One of the most lopsided states was Wyoming. Joe Biden still got roughly 27% of the vote there. West Virginia, Joe Biden got roughly 30% of the vote there. These are one of the most lopsided states in the entire union, but DC defeats it by a mile in terms of partisanship. But I don't think partisanship should be a reason as to why it's denied fair representation in the United States. Yes, it benefits the Democrats, but had any other type of state been in discussion and benefited the Republican Party, they would not oppose to adding it to the union. And many Democrats have been iffy about whether or not they support DC statehood. Initially, it was the unpopular position. The American people did not support DC becoming a state, but now they do. Now, They want D.C. to become a state. They think it's fair for them to be represented in the United States. As someone who lives on the outskirts of the District of Columbia, I think that it's important for D.C. to be represented. There are 700,000 plus residents, United States citizens, in D.C., and yet they do not get congressional representation or House representation or Senate representation the same way I do. They don't have a governor. They have a mayor. The mayor of D.C., Muriel Bowser, has a larger population to worry about than the governor in Wyoming, than the governor, I believe, in Vermont. These states may be larger in land size, but have a smaller population. And they have state legislatures. They have a lot of things that D.C. does not have because they are not a state. There's a mayor for this city itself. This district is one of the largest, one of the largest, but one of the larger cities in the entire country. I wouldn't say exactly, by any means one of the largest, but also some of those major cities are built into states that already have representation. This is the only major area, major metropolitan area that doesn't have any type of representation. I'm trying to think. I think the closest that this actually got to being done was literally 2 years ago when the House of Representatives decided to say, D.C. should become a state. But then, of course, it wouldn't have passed in the Senate. Republicans had the majority, 53 to 47. But that was probably the closest. this Senate bill hasn't even really been discussed. It's always been in the backgrounds of many people's minds, but most people had opposed it. Most politicians had been opposed to D.C. becoming a state. And now it looks as if the Democratic Party is changing their mind. And also, the immediate implication of D.C. becoming a state is that Democrats would no longer have to worry about some of those more conservative Republicans. You see, if D.C. becomes a state, Joe Manchin loses all of his leverage. All of his leverage. Gone. Because right now, he could be that one vote that votes with the Republican Party to put what they want over the top. But if D.C. becomes a state, even if he votes with the Republicans, it ties. You know who it goes to? Not Joe Manchin, but to Vice President Kamala Harris. And obviously, she'd lean in favor of the Democrats. You see, that's why Joe Manchin may not necessarily support this. If he does, it'll get rid of all of the leverage he has in the United States Senate. And he loves having leverage. Politicians love having leverage. But also, if the Republican Party is at 49 and the Republicans are at 50, he may want to, benefit his party more than he wants to himself, considering that he's only going to be up. He's going to be up for re-election in 2024, and he isn't super likely to run for Senate again. So looking at West Virginia, Joe Manchin has a very conservative constituency. All eyes on West Virginia, all eyes on Montana, all eyes on Kyrsten Sinema and Dianne Feinstein. Some of these Democratic senators haven't exactly been too encouraged to vote for the Democratic Party's ideals. And Dianne Feinstein really makes no sense. But John Tester, Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, I sort of understand it. Arizona probably the least out of all of them, but they still, when they were elected, came from Republican states. And Montana and West Virginia are absolutely still Republican states. But once, if D.C. does become a state, Democrats will no longer have to worry about that one stray vote. And even 2 or 3 stray votes if they can convince Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski to vote in their favor. So there are a number of things that need to be discussed when we talk about the implications of D.C. becoming a state. The Democrats will gain undoubtedly 2 Democratic senators and a Democratic House of Representatives member. They already have a voting body on the presidential level. A very partisan would-be state, but that's not a reason. It should be disqualified from becoming a state whatsoever. So Senate Democrats have a difficult decision to make. Will they make it a state? Will Joe Manchin want to retain the type of leverage that he has? It's not really a difficult decision for many Senate Democrats, more so for just the few conservative Democrats that would like to have a lot of leverage moving forward into what gets done and doesn't get done under a Biden administration. But so far, in order for this to pass, the Democrats would have to get rid of the filibuster practically, and it seems as if that's something that Democrats have thrown off the table. But of course, if D.C. statehood was something that many of these people have agreed to in the past, they may realize the urgency to get rid of the filibuster. Obviously, there could be adverse effects later down the road, but if D.C. becomes a state, it's going to be a little bit more harder for the Republicans to try to win back Senate control, given that they're going to have to face against 2 new Democratic senators that have never been in the United States Senate, that haven't really messed up the 100 number in half a century. So that's pretty much it. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my post-2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.